Computer. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, wherever you are in the world. Tonight's show, we're going to be talking about slavery. And it's a very interesting conversation we're going to have with the author of Barbary Slave. And I'll just read out the book and I'll just show you a quick glimpse of the book and then we'll bring it up again. There's the book. You can buy it, $7.99. I think that's very reasonably priced as well. More than 1 million white slaves taken over 3 centuries from 1500 to 1800. 1631 was one of the worst years, and it was written, a novel written by Peter Holland, who is with us now. So again, Peter, just introduce yourself and a little bit about your history.
Good evening, Graham. Yeah, and thanks for having me on.
No worries.
Well, I guess to introduce my novel, I should explain that I was inspired to write it when I did an MA in early modern history. I started doing it 4 years ago. I finished 2 years ago. The early modern period is 1500 to 1800. And I had the good fortune to do a unit of study. It was largely English and British history, but I did a unit of study on the Mediterranean, which of course didn't really directly affect us in Britain. But the Mediterranean at that time was dominated by a struggle for power between the Ottoman Empire, which we, based in Istanbul, Turkey today, which was huge, and the Christian powers led by Spain and the Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa. You have to remember back then.
Hello, we've lost your connection. Hello, sorry, technical interruption. We're now back, right? So it is now running. And again, so do you want to just carry on from where you left off there?
Yeah, sorry about that, Graham. So I studied this unit of study on the Mediterranean, and it was all about the struggle between the Ottomans and the Christians for control. And what I learned in doing that was the reliance of the Ottoman Empire on slavery, completely reliant on it. I mean, it's a huge empire. It lasted much longer than the British Empire, dating back to probably around about 1200, right through to, of course, the end of the First World War. And we all know about Lawrence of Arabia, which brought an end to the Ottoman Empire, World War I. But they were reliant on slaves. And this really became of interest to me. And I actually wrote an essay for my MA, which was about whether or not the threat of slavery to British seamen and women was brought about by the rise of the British Navy. And actually it's quite pertinent to what's gone on just in the last few weeks with all the fuss over Land of Hope and Glory. And of course the lines, Rule Britannia and all that. Rule Britannia, Rule Britannia rules the waves and Britain's never, never shall be slaves. That was written in 1740 by a Scotsman, interestingly, called Thompson. And the irony is that we've had all the fuss over it at the proms, but it was all actually untrue, because in 1740, Britain didn't rule the waves. Britain didn't really rule the waves until Nelson, with the Battle of the Nile and then the Battle of Trafalgar being 1805. That was when Britain gained supremacy at sea. And in 1740, not only wasn't Britain ruling the waves, but plenty of Britons were being taken into slavery, into the Ottoman Empire. And so I got very interested in it and I wrote this essay and I talked to people and I thought it would make a great story. And that inspired me, once I sort of got so far with my MA, to write historical fiction. That book that you held up about a story about some young English people who get taken into slavery and end up in what was called a bagno in Algiers. Algiers was probably the biggest slave city-state in the Mediterranean, if not the world. Yeah.
And I'll take it Libya and Algiers, Morocco were all part of that whole.
Yeah, I'm not sure about as far as Libya, but certainly if you go Morocco, Tripoli, Tunis in Tunisia, and Algeria. I'm just thinking of the map of North Africa. Yeah, Libya is a bit further along towards Egypt, but certainly Morocco was a huge slave state. And the interesting thing there is that whereas Algeria and Tunis were vassal states of the Ottomans had control over them, really. So those states had to serve the Sultan in Istanbul. Morocco was never conquered by the Ottomans. They remained fiercely independent. And that did have an effect on the taking of slaves, British slaves, because nothing happens like one day after the next. We're talking about over 200 or 300 years. Yeah. But when Britain finally achieved some sort of peace and treaty with Algiers and Tunis, the Moroccans started getting involved, and they did more of the slave taking in the 18th century, whereas Algeria was much more prominent in the 17th century. Yeah. So in my book, which is set in 1631, I chose that for a specific reason, which I can explain. Algeria was the big centre, but 100 years later, Morocco kind of took over.
Right. So the next thing to say to you, bearing in mind that I am English, not British, I won't get into that with you, but in the 1600s, right up to 1707, 1706, 1707, there was no such thing as the British as a power source, right? So it come from the Acts of Parliament of 1706, 1707. So anything prior to that is English. It's the English Navy, it's the English Army, or it's the Scottish Army, but the whole thing on a British level didn't exist. Now, one of the things that's really interesting to a lot of people is the history of the Navy and the Navy's response or non-response in the 1600s and then the 1700s to this situation, because there were many people in England being taken as slaves, not just England, but Wales, certainly from Ireland. There was a whole village taken from Ireland called Baltimore in County Cork. But what can you tell us about what happened, and then, if you can, lead us into where the song come from, Britannia rules the waves?
You're absolutely spot on there, Graham. And I do try to be careful when I'm talking about the Navy that we don't mix up the British Navy, which was what it was by the time of Nelson, with the English Navy, which was what it was at the time of my book, 1631. And you mentioned Baltimore. I've woven that into my story. It was in June 1631.
Yeah.
But, well, you've given me a couple of nice cues there. What happened here was that, remember, if we go back even a bit earlier to Elizabeth I, we all know about the Spanish Armada, okay? Yeah. And not only was Philip the King really unhappy with us because of what had happened to Mary, and obviously Britain becoming a Protestant state, and so he wanted to return us to Catholicism. But not only that, but Elizabeth, she, being very, very clever and political, signed treaties and agreements with the North African corsairs, so the Algerians and the Tunisians. And what that did was they agreed to not take British seamen or people around the coastline as slaves, because of course our great enemy was Spain, and Spain was the major thorn in the side of the corsairs, because Spain was ruled by was in the earlier 1500s ruled by Charles V, who was the Holy Roman Emperor. Yeah. He wasn't just the King of Spain; he ruled much of swathes of Europe, and he was the great adversary of the Sultan. So you've got that history, and so England, had treaties with those North African corsairs. But of course, Elizabeth dies, and she's succeeded by her cousin, James I, who's a Scotsman. And this is, I imagine, of interest to you. And James came down, and he was an odd sort of bloke. He was obsessed with things like witchcraft, but he was quite pragmatic, and he realized we can't continue to be at odds with the Spanish, because they were the most powerful country in Europe. Don't forget, they were basically colonizing South America and the Caribbean and Central America, Mexico, and so on. They were immensely powerful, far stronger than England. And so James made peace with the Spanish king. And as soon as he did that, we became fair game for the North African pirates, the North African Barbary corsairs. And so I believe he signed a treaty with them in 1604. It might have been 1606, forgive me if it's out a year or two. And from that point on, we became legitimate targets for the Barbary corsairs, who were taking seamen and also raiding coastlines to feed into the Ottoman Empire. And
so let me just go back on that. So King James, the Scottish king, in effect, was responsible for the English being enslaved.
You could argue that, yeah.
Right. So, and the second thing is,
well,
you
mentioned, to say he's responsible, I mean, that's your interpretation, obviously. But his making peace with Spain made us legitimate targets.
Got you. So,
from his point of view, Spain was a bigger problem than pirates.
Yeah, no, I agree. So, and then the next issue is that, and this is brief, and I don't want to spend any time on this. I just want to ask you a question. King James, you say he was into witchcraft. Well, would you describe him as a Satanist?
No.
Right.
No. He actually wrote a pamphlet about witches and witchcraft, because he was obsessed with the idea of the divine right of kings.
Yeah.
So a king or a queen has been chosen to be king of England or whichever country by God.
Yeah.
And he got spooked by something. I think he might have nearly got drowned at sea, in a storm. And he believed this was my understanding, that he must have been cursed by witches. And he became quite obsessed with that subject.
Right.
And it was following him that you had things like the witchcraft sort of craze in the 1640s, which was during his son's reign.
The witching ponds.
Yeah, and the Witchfinder General, Matthew Hopkins.
Yeah.
Remember the Vincent Price film?
Yeah.
But he was real. He was a horrible man.
Yeah.
We're going at a bit of a tangent from slavery, but he was a horrible man who made a lot of money by terrorizing communities and women, really.
Yeah. Okay. So back onto the slavery element of that again. So how did the English Navy, or there wasn't much of an English Navy? I mean, I know from, and I've got a number of books in front of me here, Thomas Pellow, there's one there. That's the true, and this is actually written by Thomas Pellow. He was taken as an 11-year-old from Cornwall, and his 50-year-old uncle, who was a fisherman. It was the first time he'd ever been out on a fishing boat. He was literally taken out as a cabin boy and enslaved. And it took him 23 years to escape and get back. But that's the true story from him himself telling the story. So again, at what stage was the English Navy in that era? Why was they so ineffective? And go on.
Okay. So at the time of the Armada, the English Navy was quite sizable. There were over 100 ships, which was a lot. Yeah. Okay. And that Elizabeth grew that from what her father left. So Henry VIII left a relatively small number of ships. We didn't need a navy because he wasn't at war with anybody overseas, although he did fight France over Calais. But okay, so Elizabeth built up the navy. James I and his son were responsible, if you want to use that word, for allowing the navy to go into decline. If I don't have the numbers to hand. If I realised we were going to discuss that, I would have got them. But it really did shrink down to maybe 15 or 20 ships. So in this, let's say the first half of the 17th century, in 1600 through to about 1650, the English Navy was just allowed to decline in numbers. Okay, and that was when the English were really susceptible and vulnerable to slave taking from the North Africans. It carried on for another 100 years or more, but that was the nadir, if you like, the worst time for the English. And of course, there's no coincidence that was when the raid on Baltimore that you mentioned occurred. That was in 1631, in June 1631. Anyway, the rise of the English Navy really only occurred with the Republic, if you like, under Cromwell. And under Cromwell, Britain became a much more, we were gradually becoming more of a trading nation. Don't forget, by that time we had colonies in North America, and he did begin to build the navy. But it wasn't, and this is a key point, he didn't build a navy to defeat North African corsairs taking English people as slaves. That would be a nice romantic notion. He built a navy to fight the Dutch.
Right.
Because in the middle of the 17th century, the Dutch were a hugely powerful country, hugely powerful. For such a small place, they had great power.
Yeah.
They had a lot of control of the African slave trade. They were great traders, and they actually defeated us in a number of battles, so that at one point they had control of the Channel, the English Channel, the Dutch, those nice little, lovely people, aren't they? Dennis Bergkamp and all that. But they were a very fearsome nation, and Cromwell really rebuilt and invested in the navy to beat the Dutch, so that we could trade freely, so we could sail down the English Channel and not be afraid of being sunk or being taken by the Dutch. It wasn't because of slavery, and in fact, we tried the English tried several times to take on the Barbary city-states like Algiers and failed, and we had to end up signing treaties with them and pay them money to get slaves back.
That's right. Again, that in itself became a problem, because they was then targeting the wealthy ones, because they knew they would be paid for them.
It was called redemption, the redemption of slaves. And there would actually, and in fact, when I was doing my MA dissertation, which was not about slavery, it was about the town I live in, the workhouse, I came across church records, and collections were held in churches all over England. Yeah. And in fact, in 1641 or 42, forgive me if I get the year wrong, this was all discussed in Parliament. But of course, the Civil War was impending. The Civil War was about to begin. They all knew there was going to be a civil war. Parliament knew they were going to have to take on the king. And of course, he eventually moves to Oxford. So London and Parliament is parliamentarian, the Roundheads, so to speak. But there were reports in parliamentary papers saying that the fishermen are afraid to go to sea. And Barbary corsair galleys were actually seen in in the Thames estuary. They sailed up the Thames estuary.
Really?
They were that powerful. And there was great fear. And so what should we do? What should we do? Well, Parliament decreed that to get slaves back, that they wouldn't do anything, because they were going to fight. They were going to fight a civil war. They decreed that churches and parishes all over the country had to have collections to raise the money to redeem the slaves.
And what year was this, roughly?
That was in that report in Parliament was in 1641 or 1642.
Right.
Yeah. So almost nothing was done for a long time, not because people didn't want to. Everybody knew about people being taken as slaves, but we just weren't that big and strong and powerful. I mean, as I said, the most powerful country in Europe through that early modern period, really, well, for quite a long time, was Spain.
Yeah.
And they even tried an invasion of Algiers and failed. They sent 20,000 men to try and invade Algiers, and they were beaten by the Algerians, because these people were very fearsome.
Yeah.
And the irony there is that I do explain this in my book, the early part of the book, because the book's not totally unsympathetic to the Barbary Corsairs. You know, it's not a case of bad Muslim, good Christian, really. The Barbary Corsairs were largely descended from people who were called Moriscos. And of course, we all know about Spain. We've all seen El Cid, haven't we? And the conflict in Spain between the Muslim South. The Muslims had a stronghold. They were called Moors.
Yeah,
the Moors had a stronghold in Spain for 700 years.
Yeah.
They were only finally kicked out in 1492, the same year that Columbus sailed.
Yeah.
They lost Granada, but they'd been there for 700 years. And at first, the Moors, the Spanish Muslims, were tolerated. Then they were forced to convert, and they became known as Moriscos. But they were easily identifiable because they were much darker in complexion than the fair-skinned Spanish.
Yeah.
And then there was they got fed up of being treated as second-class citizens, and in the 1560s, the Moriscos, the former Spanish Moors, rebelled, and after that, the Spanish decided to go the whole hog, and they expelled them all in 1609.
Yeah.
So in 1609, about 300,000 former Spanish Moors were expelled from Spain. Well, where would they all go? A lot of them went to Istanbul, but a lot of them sailed across the Med to the North African states, and they were angry young men. You can imagine.
So they created their own unique identity over there, basically.
Well, they got absorbed into North African society. They weren't the North African tribes that dominated, that Barbary coast is named after, were the Berbers. But the Moriscos got absorbed. They're all Muslims, so they saw themselves as brothers. But they became well motivated pirates. Yeah. Then served the Ottomans in seizing white Christians as slaves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so how many, and is there any sort of record of this, but how many white English people and white people were taken into slavery in total, do you think?
Yeah, over the sort of 200 years, let's say 250 years, from about 1550 to 1800, there were over 1 million white European Christians taken into slavery. But they were largely, of course, from Spain, France, Italy, the Balkans, the Ottomans farm, when we all know about the conflict that's gone on for centuries there, the interface between Christianity and Islam with Bosnia and the countries down there that was Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia basically put a cap, held down any animosity between Christians and Muslims in the Balkans. But once the communist bloc broke down, all the old enmity and hatred came to the fore, and we know about that, don't we, with Srebrenica and so on.
I have spoken about it many times.
Yeah, but so it was mainly the Mediterranean coastline where the 1 million plus were taken from, but they got as far north as Iceland. In 1627, a famous Barbary coast pirate called Murat Rees, who was a converted Dutchman. He was a Dutchman called Jan Zulen. It's in my book. He led an expedition, a small fleet up there, and they took over 400. And of the 400 they took in 1627, only 2 ever got back. to Iceland. And this is very famous folklore in Iceland. We don't know about it, but it's a big thing in Ireland. And I believe there was an Icelandic film and book about it all. And then, of course, you mentioned that the biggest raid in the British Isles was Baltimore in June 1631. And that's one of the reasons why that's the month that my book is set in. Because in my book, my fiction is that I've got this fine young Englishman and this beautiful young English girl, and they both get taken captive. She's seized from a lovely village in Cornwall I used to love visiting called Mevagissey.
Yeah.
So, but that's fiction. But then I have the guys who took her. They go on a week later. They're involved in the raid on Baltimore. So I've woven my fiction into it with my characters. But Murat Reis and Baltimore was true.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so of the 1 million, about 50,000 were from the British Isles.
Well, again, just to show people, and again, we're presenting your book here, so I'll come back to it. If you want to show your book up on the screen there as well. There's the book. It's called The Stolen Village, Baltimore, the Barbary Pilots. And it's quite a thick book. Let me tell you something. It's got a lot of the original maps in it and shows you exactly where they attacked and who they took. And this is all history that you're not taught in school, right? So we'll get on to that. But if you want to show us your book on the screen, here it is. And I do hope I get a signed copy.
Of course you will.
Okay. So again, let me just show people this. So if you want an interesting read, again, fiction, but woven in to real history. Yeah. So as long as people understand, I'll just put that up there. You can see it up there. I will put the link to Waterstones in the video description, so you can go and buy that. So again, we've gone through that element of it, and now we're understanding there is obviously a difference between the English Navy and in the British Navy and how it come about. The Scots basically assisted because they weren't taking, as far as I know, they didn't take Scots, so they didn't look for particularly Scottish as slaves.
I'd say that largely because of geography. You know, they were seizing seamen from ships sailing maybe sort of down through the channel out into the Atlantic Ocean. Yeah. And so it's no coincidence that Baltimore raid is at the very it's the very southeast tip of Ireland. They didn't really sail up around what today, up towards Dublin or around the top, around Northern Ireland as we know it today. And so they didn't really raid the Scottish coastline because they probably would have felt rather remote, from home and more in danger themselves. Not that they didn't want Scots.
No, but it was
easy.
It's
not that a Scotsman would have brought less money than an Englishman in the slave market.
Well, okay. Well, I won't argue that one.
I mean, and on that, the what would happen to, and I'll tell you why. What would happen to the slaves was that a huge number of them, Graham, ended up as galley slaves. Yeah. Because in their wars with the Spanish and the Italian city-states of Venice and Genoa, the Ottomans had these huge galleys, and a galley was big, and it could have 400 slaves rowing. Yeah. And in a battle, and there was a famous battle called the Battle of Lepanto between Spain and its allies and the Ottomans. The Christians won. Something like 110 galleys were taken, were captured by the Christians. Okay, but 50 were sunk. Now, those 50 that were sunk, they could each have 400 slaves on, and they would have gone down with the ship because they would have been chained. They would have been chained in the galley. And so the life expectancy of a galley slave wasn't great. And another interesting thing is that they didn't try to replenish their stock of slaves at home, they didn't breed slaves like, you know, the Europeans did in the Caribbean and in America. They had to keep replacing them. And so there was a huge demand to keep providing a supply of slaves into the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah.
At that Battle of Lepanto, 12,000 galley slaves were set free. 12,000 at one battle. They would have been on the ships that were captured. Yeah. So
they freed 12,000 slaves, and you know but you've hit something else there, which I'm not going to go into too much detail with. But you've mentioned about the breeding of slaves in, for example, the Americas or the Caribbean or whatever you want to describe it as. But the Barbary and if you like, the Islamic slave trade, one of the reasons that they haven't got a lot of black Africans in Saudi Arabia is because they castrated their slaves. And that is there's a big difference between what happened in America and what happened in Saudi Arabia. And bearing in mind that the kingdom of Saudi Arabia was created by the British. What I'm saying is that's quite a recent thing. If you go back further in history, you know, Saudi Arabia as such, as it is now, as a kingdom, didn't exist.
Well, yeah, what we know as Saudi Arabia emerged after World War I with the sort of dissection of the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah.
You know, the Ottoman Empire came to an end with World War I, really. You're right, and it was made up of several powerful families, you know, tribal leaders. And it's only an important country today because of oil. Let's face it. What you said there about the castration of slaves, they certainly castrated the eunuchs, who guarded harems.
Yeah.
And if I go back to what I was saying there about the use of the slaves, whereas when we and white Europeans took African slaves across the Atlantic, we'd probably take as many women as men, and they were bred. I mean, it's putting it very crudely, but that's what it was. It was an economic system, after all. The Ottomans didn't do that, and maybe only 1 in 10 of slaves taken would be a woman, because they largely seized seamen working on ships. Yeah. But they would raid coastal villages and so on. And of course, the women would be taken largely to be either domestic slaves or even concubines.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I've got that in my story. I've got this beautiful English girl, and she's going to be sold off to be somebody's into some rich man's harem. You know, that was all real, but they were primarily interested in men for hard labour, to either build their fortresses or to row on their galleys.
Yeah. Yeah. And now, back to the women, if they were you know, put in harem, what we're actually talking about is an enforced or forced brothel, and therefore, I mean, I don't like calling them prostitutes because they're not actually earning any, they're literally slaves, are being used and abused within that arena. But again, you know, it was sexual slavery.
Yeah, they were concubines. That's the word for it. They're a concubine. Yeah, I certainly wouldn't use the word prostitute. That would be completely inaccurate. But what the other thing I'd pick you up on was that if a man or woman was taken as a slave, a Christian was taken as a slave, they could get their freedom by converting to Islam, and that's where you get the term "turn Turk." Turn Turk was you would embrace Islam and you become free, because Islam dictates that you can make other people, non-believers, infidel, can be taken as slaves, but not another Muslim.
Yeah.
And another thing to point out, I mean, obviously, yeah, the idea of being, you know, one of our daughters being taken as a concubine is the most awful thought. But for the woman, I've got to be careful what I say here. But if she was favoured, if she became the favourite in the harem of the rich man, she would live a very privileged life. And the most famous, I don't know if you know about the Ottomans much, but the most famous Ottoman sultan of all time Muslims and who learn Muslim history would know him. He was known as Suleiman the Magnificent.
Yeah.
And he was the Sultan at the time of Henry VIII, funny enough.
Yeah.
When Henry VIII was king over here, he was the Sultan he was control of the Ottomans. And he almost overran Europe. He got as far as the gates of Vienna.
Yeah.
He got to the gates of Vienna, and Hungary and Bulgaria, they were all Greece, they were all controlled by the Ottomans under him. Anyway, he obviously had a harem. I'm sure he had plenty of beautiful girls in his harem. But his favourite was one called...
Right, you've seized up slightly there.
And she became the mother of his children and successors. And when he would go off travelling, because not only did he fight the Europeans, he was also fighting the Persians further east into what we know as Iran.
Yeah.
He was always fighting them. So he was always at war. But when he was away, she virtually she was in charge of what you might have called the government at the time. So a woman, I'm not saying it's a great career move, but if a woman was taken as a slave and became the favourite of the Sultan or the rich man, she could become a very privileged person in that house, that environment, that community.
Yeah. Well, again, that's what happened to, not literally what happened to Thomas Pellow, but he was very intelligent and worked out his way to get from A to B to C, you know, and then he started being the commander of the castle, and he was under the, you know, then he protected the castle, and he gained the trust of them completely until he found a time when he could escape, and he did. And he was successful. So he was very clever in what he did. Some people, you know, in life, you have to use strategy sometimes that you do save your life. As long as you're not sort of putting anyone else under the bus, it's, you know, it's your own strategy to save your own life.
Yeah, yeah. No, you're right. People had to get by and survive, didn't they? And so it's called apostasy. If you give up your religion, renounce your religion. I mean, today, you and I, if I decided, oh, I'm not going to be a Christian anymore, I'm going to be a Hindu, well, no one's going to kill me for it, I'd hope, not in England. We're allowed that freedom. But it wasn't always like that. And of course, in some countries, it's seen as the worst possible thing you can do in your life. Certainly today, you know, the tolerance or lack of tolerance in somewhere like Saudi Arabia or Pakistan, and you hear about these there was a poor girl in Pakistan not long ago. You know, there was calls to have her executed because they said she'd committed blasphemy. Yeah. Of course, you know, for you and I, so what? Well, interestingly, in my third book, which is about Cromwell, I became fascinated with Oliver Cromwell. What a great figure. It's about social change and intolerance in England. I left the slavery subject alone.
Hang on a minute. Cromwell. Hang on a minute. Cancel Christmas. Cancel Christmas. You mean that?
Close all the theatres. Close all the theatres. You get those sort of banners and catchphrases around somebody, but he was more complicated than that, Graham. He was, whilst he despised and hated Catholicism, so, you know, he's never going to be a hero to any Irishman. He was actually tolerant of other Christian sects. Yeah. He wanted tolerance. He believed that providing you were a Christian Protestant, it didn't matter what you were, whether you were a Baptist or a Puritan or a Presbyterian, it didn't matter. And he was more tolerant than a lot of people around at the time. Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, my third novel's about all that. I mean, under him, well, not under him, they started before. He became the ruler of England, if you like, in 1653. Yeah. But after the Royalists were defeated, from 1648 onwards, Parliament, which became dominated by Puritans and Presbyterians, started passing morality laws. Yeah. And that was when adultery became a capital punishment. And so my third book is about a young woman she was the last person to be hanged for the crime of adultery in England. Her name was Susan Bounty. I'll have to go and get a copy and put it up on here. In 1654, she'd had an affair with a married man. She couldn't deny it. She got pregnant, and they let her give birth. Then they hanged her down in Devon.
All right.
And she was the last person to be executed for the crime of adultery. But also blasphemy was severely punished. Prostitutes were rounded up and sent into slavery in Jamaica. They were sent over to what was called indentured servitude as slaves, really. So they were called the morality laws, and Cromwell came along and became the Lord Protector, the, if you like, dictator of England on the back after they'd been passed.
Yeah.
I don't think he was totally comfortable with them. I believe he felt they went too far, and he was actually a more tolerant man than some simple interpretations of history would have us believe.
I certainly wouldn't say you was wrong there. There's someone else who is a historian. He's more of a military historian, which is Robin Tilbrook. And I mean, he knows a lot about Oliver Cromwell. And
I'm just moving with the computer so I can get this other book to show you.
Yeah, no, that's all right.
But I'm still on screen there.
You're still on screen, yeah. What's your head there as you go through that old English cottage?
This house is 500 years old.
It looks it. I love them beams.
Yeah. Anyway, so I've got it. I'm just going back there. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
I'm getting carried away. I'm getting into the conversation, Graham.
I told you would. Let me just I'll grab one of these other ones up here as well. There's some really good stuff I've got on that, but not. I mean, I don't go deeply into Cromwell. I'm more of a constitutionalist than the law, and it's funny to say that though. Is with Cromwell, he actually was the first person to create an English written codified constitution. And once a new king come in, that was pushed to one side again. But we have got an English constitution anyway. But that's the other one that I've got there, and I actually bought that at the Oliver Cromwell Museum.
Ely.
Yeah, the English.
I was there 6 weeks ago.
Oh, was ya?
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. No,
you nice little museum. That.
Yeah, that's it. It's a nice little museum. And they've got all the little things that you can buy there. So I bought a lot of stuff, and I give them out to English Democrats and a lady friend of mine in America.
Yeah.
But also all these original swords, his armour, the leathers he wore are all there.
Yeah.
You get the real feel of what it felt like to be, in that Civil War when you go in there.
Yeah. Yeah. Very good. Very good. Really well worth a trip. That's my book, which sort of is more about him. If you can see it.
All right, Susan Bounty.
Yeah, Susan Bounty. I named it after her because she's notable as being this last person to be executed, hanged for the crime of adultery. But it's more about him. But I thought if I called a book Oliver Cromwell, how's that different to 1,000 other books, to do with Oliver Cromwell? Yeah. And the fact that, she was a young woman, she was probably about 18 years old. And, she was hanged because she had an affair with a married man. So, it shows that we see pictures and hear stories from places like Saudi Arabia. But just to think that 350 years ago, we were doing that as well. But thankfully, it didn't last for long. Yeah.
But the difference, and that's the main difference between us and the ideology of Islam, is that it is everything, even apostasy. Even in this country, you have honour killing. I won't go into details. Honour killings. You are ostracised if you leave that community. It is a pretty wicked and evil thing. If you want to stand up and say, "Listen, I don't want to be involved with this," and you want to take your family out, or you on your own, you're completely. At best, you are ostracised. At worst, you are murdered because the sentence to this day is still execution. literally for apostasy. So, okay, so we've talked about the slave side of that, and so the next thing is, I mean, do you know anything about the brief history period of black slavery that we was, involved in on the transport level, etc.? And there is something else I'm going to bring into the conversation in a couple of seconds about that. But, if you look at the figures, black slaves were sent to the Americas and other places around the world, including, by the way, and still are, Saudi Arabia and now Libya. What was the figures in that period? Do you know what the figures were?
I've got some knowledge. It puts into context. So if we talk about the white slave trade, as we did a while ago, and there being just over 1 million, maybe it was 1.25 million, 1.25 million, over the same period, the number of black Africans taken across the Atlantic, so by white Europeans, was about 12 million. Of that number, we start off as England, but then in fact, by the time, and then it was Britain in the 18th century, and America were responsible for about 1 to 1.5 million of them. Interestingly, most people would never guess it, but the country which took most black Africans across the Atlantic into slavery was Portugal. They account for nearly half of all the black Africans taken into slavery across the Atlantic. They took about 6 million. And I don't think that makes them 6 times more evil or bad than us. I think it's because they were doing it for longer. They started taking the slaves across 100 years before the British, and they carried on for about 70 years after the British. They were doing it right up until the late 1800s, nearly. But also, I think the thing there is that being taken as a slave to equatorial Brazil would be far more severe in terms of conditions, and the mortality rates were much higher than being taken to, say, Barbados or Jamaica or Georgia. Although, I'm not saying that they had it easy, but the mortality rates were so high in Brazil because of the climatic conditions. You mentioned black Africans being taken north to the Middle East. That's absolutely right. And the Middle East, the Muslims, if you like, were doing it long before we did, and they continued long after we stopped. And yes, you're right. Some people say it still goes on today. Funny enough, my wife went for a holiday to Zanzibar. She went to Tanzania and Zanzibar. Well, Zanzibar was a huge slave port. Of course, it's on the eastern side of Africa, and they were taken from the eastern side of Africa more than the western side, but they would be shipped up to the Middle East and to the Ottomans. And of course, West Africans were taken north across the Great Desert, across the Sahara. And we Timbuktu was a sort of stopping off, a trading town or city in the desert on the way to the North African coast, and then taken to the Middle East. But I don't know the numbers. Graham, if I said a number, I'd be making it up. So I won't hazard to do that.
And I understand that. We're going to slightly jump over onto another person now from English history that most people have never heard of. But before I actually get into that one, people don't realise that Saudi Arabia only officially, which I mean they made it law, only officially stopped slavery in 1962.
Yeah, well, and parts of Nigeria only banned it, made it illegal in the 1920s. As you say, officially. But I believe even there you'd find Nigerian historians who would say that it has still gone on. Well, and of course you had Boko Haram taking 200 Christian Nigerian girls. They took them as sex slaves.
Yeah. No, I
Imagine that. That was only, was that 5 or 6 years ago?
Yeah.
Not within the last decade. They raided a private school and took 200 girls.
Yeah, disgusting. I know. And again, you know, the only people really standing up to that now today is President Trump and his regime against, you know, slavery, or what they call modern day slavery, but it's not that modern when you look at it. But again, I mean, I'll take you've heard of someone called William Wilberforce.
Of course, yeah.
See, you might say, of course, but the audience might go, who's he then? Right? So William Wilberforce was the guy that pushed through and stopped, you know, in terms of creating a law and the abolition of slavery in this country. What people don't know is the person that actually did it, yeah, is this guy. And I've got his memoirs, and it's the memoirs of Granville Sharp, Esquire, and that is actually a picture of him on the front. This book is literally his diaries and his transcripts of what happened. And let me tell you something, it's absolutely fascinating, not only just to read what happened and what he did and the conversations that he had with various people, but also to look at what he did. Bearing in mind he was a tailor, so I'm a constitutional historian, if you like. But I'm a layperson in constitutional law. The reason I say that is because this man stopped slavery in common law jurisdictions. He actually stood up to the High Court and protected the slaves, the black slaves. The black slaves loved him. They come here, and at one time, if you set foot on English soil as a slave, you was free. And the reason for all of this mainly was because of the work of Granville Sharp, who then went on to create a place called Freetown in Sierra Leone. And he actually purchased a number of acres because the black slaves didn't want to stay here. There was none of this, you know, we're going to repatriate and all that. People just said, if you want to stay, you can stay. But what do you want to do? And they said, we don't know where we come from. We just know we come from Africa. Because a lot of them were taken as children. Some of them were so uneducated, they didn't realise where they was from. But they knew it was Africa. So Granville Sharp was the person that, a tailor from Durham, educated himself on English law, and he was the one who financed and put the case forward for a slave called Somerset. And that was a very famous case, and it changed everything, because up until it was always known to people in English common law that slavery was unlawful. The British, in effect, and the colonies were, in effect, doing things that were unlawful. They may have been legal, but they were unlawful in terms of our constitution and English common law. And one of the slavers took this guy Somerset, handcuffed him to the mast, the main mast of the ship, and started to go out on the Thames. Before he left English waters, Granville Sharp was the guy that went in at his own expense to the Royal Courts of Justice and was issued with a writ of habeas corpus. He then hired a boat, a faster boat, and chased the ship, boarded the ship, and handed the writ of habeas corpus to the skipper. The skipper was fuming, and so was the slaver. They was then brought back to London, and so was Somerset. And the court case ensued. It was such a famous case that the single judge said, I need 3 other judges to sit with me on this. And the judge warned the slaver, if you allow this to continue, you may not like our answer. So in other words, what he was saying is this will change trade forever. And there is an old saying, let the heavens fall, which means what will be, what will be. Whatever happens, the law must be obeyed. And eventually what happened was, and there is a phrase that comes from that trial, because it was found that he had to be released and he was no longer a slave. And the phrase that come from that trial and that court case was literally the words, the English air is too pure for any slave to breathe. Free the black. And that's exactly what happened. And when you start to look at these elements, I think you've got a fly on your screen.
Yeah, that's right. I wonder what was going on there for a second.
So did I. Right, so that is that. So Granville, and again, the book about him, etc. No one ever speaks about him. No one knows about him in history. They speak of William Wilberforce. Again, he knew all these people, and he knew a number of people in America. He knew people in England. He knew, and he was connected because he found the slave trade abhorrent and said, this is not right. This is unlawful, and we must change it. And again, he helped 6 slaves. And yet again, you've got these groups, and I won't go into the politics of it. Black Lives Matter, for example, who are depicting the white person as this evil group of people that had this slave trade going. Yet they ignore the rest of history. They focus on a piece of history, of British history, and give no acknowledgement to the English. We're always the English, stick your hand up and say, I'm English, and I believe in English common law and the English common law constitution. You're called a racist. You're called a Nazi. You're called all these things when we're not. We're just, listen, we tell you the truth about English history, and it's these people in the background that have hid it from us. So I just wanted, I mean, have you heard much or know anything of Granville Sharp?
Well, I know of him along with Wilberforce, but I didn't have knowledge of that detail. I've not seen that book there, Graham. So I've learned something from you, listening to you, this last few minutes. That's very interesting. And I think the broader comment I'd make there is that it didn't all happen. Again, I've said it before, it didn't all happen overnight. The campaigns to abolish slavery went on for decades and decades. There were great petitions of like 20, 30, 40,000 signatures, all protesting against slavery, particularly down, funny enough, around Bristol, where a lot of the protests were over that statue, the Causden statue. It's a shame there are no statues for, fine men or women who argued against slavery and brought an end to it. And that's not my specialist area, so I've got to be careful what I say, but I do know that it was to do with things like British law, which decreed that a man or woman couldn't be a slave living in Britain, which goes back to, I believe, sort of started with Magna Carta, really. And they were able to argue that it was illegal to have somebody as a chattel in England.
Yeah.
And so that was the start. But of course, then they had to argue against people being able to own slaves as chattels in the Caribbean and in the colonies.
Correct.
And of course, they were up against men of great wealth and power and influence, who could get access to MPs. And so it took another 30 years, didn't it? I think there were 30 years between the abolition of the slave trade and the abolition of slavery throughout what we could call the empire.
And again, you're absolutely right there. It was the best part of a lifetime's work for Granville Sharp. It was his passion, his depth of knowledge, and the connections he made at very senior levels. In some cases, writing letters, and the letters are in there that he wrote anonymously to certain people, and then when they finally contacted him, and they said, "Who are you, really?" and he said, "Granville Sharp," and they go, "Okay, now we get what you're talking about." So he's just found different ways of coming and putting his voice across, even if he had to write a letter in a fake name. As long as they read the letter, it was in their minds. He was a very clever man, very, very clever strategist as
and
well.
you also got to realise that at the time, England, Britain, communications were completely different to what they are today.
Yeah.
There's no 24-hour news, and so
There was no email.
one of the areas that was the groups who were really instrumental, very prominent in getting slavery abolished, were non-conformist church groups like the Quakers.
Yeah.
Quakers are very good people, very moral. They were persecuted in Cromwell's time and for about 100 years after, but they're very, very strong principles, and they protested heavily and lobbied for decades and decades against the abomination of slavery. For them, it was an abomination that any man, regardless of his colour, could be a slave. And I hope I'm not making a mistake, but I believe the Wedgwood family, from the potteries, the nice china, I believe they were Quakers. They may not have been, but they were fiercely anti-slavery, and they would produce cups and saucers and crockery, and on the bottom of the plate would be little graphics of slaves with little messages, sort of arguing against the abomination of slavery.
Yeah.
And so that was like a pressure group, because it was a way of raising awareness to somebody, a nice lady sitting in her tea room in Harpenden. What does she know about slavery? She's never going to probably see a black person in her life. Yeah. But it was a way of communication and spreading the argument to people.
Yeah.
So, I think the key thing to realise or to be aware of, is that these things didn't, it wasn't like, oh, we think slavery is wrong, so we have a massive campaign in the social media and TV and everything, and we've abolished it 6 months later. It took decades and decades, and you're right, people like him devoted their lives to it, but they were often very religious, very Christians with very strong convictions.
Yeah. No, I agree, and I regard him not as a politician, but as a constitutionalist. And as a constitutionalist, for me, and especially obviously the English Constitution, it is based on Christian law. So, and the Bible and the Ten Commandments. Yeah. So, for me, it is something special, and that we need to stand up for the English Constitution.
I'm not particularly devout Christian, but we're a very, very secular country. And we think it's kind of odd that when we see people in other countries being very religious, but really we're the odd ones out, because most countries in the world are quite religious, but we're a very secular state, which is something we can be proud of. It's good because we don't get the same sort of religious intolerance. But, and just going off at another tangent, in the American Civil Rights Movement, the churches were as important as the political parties in fighting against slavery, and also after that, later on, the civil rights movement. It's no coincidence that Martin Luther King was a church minister.
Yeah.
A lot of them were, and a lot of the momentum for change came through the churches, and that was the same here with the abolition of slavery.
Yeah. No, I agree entirely, and again, a lot of that now has been removed. What I describe it as the Marxist, but the Fabian Society and all these other groups that are almost demonic towards the English, and we're the people that have produced so much for the world. I've went through the history of what we've produced and given to the world. Even what we're doing now, the World Wide Web. It was invented by an Englishman. He didn't ask for money for it. He created it. People all over the world have now got literally a global university where they can, get information at their fingertips and read the original scripts. Whereas before you would have had to, book up and go into a specialist centre of, Cambridge or Oxford, and you'd have someone standing over you as you was reading through it, or, you know, taking pictures or even drawing it. Some people. So we've got so much to be proud of as English, and that's the main thing that I try and put out on this show. So, if do you think there's anything that you want to add, or do you think?
No, I've enjoyed the conversation, Graham. I mean, I've learned a few things from you. I think what I'd say is when you look at these subjects, I mean, I like to call myself a historian because I've got a master's degree in it. It's important to try and be precise and accurate. That's what I'd say. Yeah. And so sometimes, like, you might ask me a question, I'm almost reluctant to answer it because I may not be quite right, or I'm not completely confident. But you're right. You should read primary source material like that Granville Sharp text with all his letters and writings, because you will get the truth. Exactly. Rather than being told what you just said there earlier about Marxists and favouring society. The danger we've got in today, I would say, is that people are becoming too tribal, and they tend to look at everything through a prism. And it might be the prism, I mean, since World War II, a lot of universities have been dominated by people of the left, so they might look through a Marxist prism. Today, feminism is really strong, so they might look at history through the feminist prism, or they might look at it through the prism of race, or they might look at it through the prism of class. And so you've got to be careful in that you can interpret history purely through your prism. And really, there should be balance, which I do like, you know, when you're challenging people, just if you called it demonizing English people, I do like the fact that you're challenging that. And I think it's well worth considering. I was talking to a friend, just to conclude, sorry, I was talking to a friend earlier, he's a university professor, and we were talking about the BBC. I bet that's one of your pet subjects, right? And I said to him, how many BBC reporters do you think voted for Conservatives in the last election? And he said, well, probably none. But then more people voted Conservative than Labour. And so why don't they have more representation in the BBC? I mean, I don't want to start being political because it's not the conversation. So I think there's always room to try and find balance.
I agree. And let me just say this to you. I'm not a politician. I'm a constitutionalist. And the Constitution is about the rule of law, the law of the land, the English Constitution, the Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, and everything that our ancestors gave us to be free. And the prism of the Constitution is the widest prism of all, because it's about freedom. And that's the thing. Don't get caught up in all these little fires that the politicians create to create hatred of one another. Instead, look at the bigger sphere and the bigger picture. And that is literally what God wanted for us, was to be happy. Let me finish on this. I've noticed behind you, you have a picture of a military man. Just give us a quick explanation of what that picture is.
Oh God, I'll get the computer to let's get that bit up there. Where is he? Can you see him?
Yeah.
Oh, there you are. Yeah, he was my wife's grandfather, and he was awarded the Military Cross in World War One. He for an act of heroism. Yeah. And he was a Scotsman, and he went on to be a headmaster of a secondary school in Govan, which is of course famous as a sort of tough area of Glasgow. Yeah. And I suspect he found that more difficult than World War One.
Good. I'll make you right there. Okay.
Just one last thing, if I can, Graham. If anyone's interested in my books, obviously I'd love to sell millions of copies and become rich. Who wouldn't? If you want to buy the ebook, you go through Amazon. If you want to buy the paperback, please go to this website, brigand.london.
Right. Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, brigand.london, because you can't buy the paperback through Amazon. They just they're the big leviathan that basically well, they're not very generous, put it that way.
No, they're not. I know, and I completely agree. Well,
but the books are available as ebooks through Amazon. Yeah.
Right. Well, again, we'll put that information out on the description. Peter Holland, author of Barbary Slave, thank you very much for joining us. Stay on the line while I pull this one down. But people, thanks for joining us. Hope you've enjoyed the show. Don't forget to give us plenty of likes. Don't forget to subscribe. And don't forget to buy Peter's book. That's it. Be lucky. And don't forget what I believe in. The Constitution is the solution.